Hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth installment of Lasers for Beginners. Today I'm going to be explaining how to get your first engraving done. So this assumes that you've already set up your laser in relation to the software that you're going to be using. In this case I'm going to show you how to use Lightburn. This is by no means an exhaustive tutorial on Lightburn. There's a lot of tutorials out there on teaching specifics about it, but really if you're a beginner and you really want to just get your first engraving going, then I'm going to show you how to do it. So let's get started. So firstly, you would have noticed that I've already made 3 other videos. Some of that is related to getting your enclosure sorted out, ensuring that you're getting the right spacing to focus your laser adequately and quickly, and then finally looking at the software that typically comes with lasers such as these, proprietary software versus Lightburn. As I mentioned, I'm a really big fan of Lightburn. It's very versatile, very powerful, and rock solid. So I'm just going to show you some of the basics, and yeah, that will help you just build on that as you get into this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch on my laser. Firstly, you see it makes a click. So basically, once you've got it all set up and you've set up your work area around you and you've connected it to the COM, it is now connected. So the first thing that you want to do is just make sure that your layout is correct. You might want a slightly different layout. I find that this generally works for me. So obviously you can see what's happening in my workpiece on the left hand side here, and on the right I've got 2 toolbars. The first one is called Move and the second one is called Laser. These are the ones that I primarily use. Now if you want to get these set up, you can go to Window and then select them over here. So one is called Laser and one is called Move. So if you just check that box, it will pop up somewhere on your screen and you can just move it into the locations that you want it. Now the first thing that I always do when I switch on my laser is I home it. So I push the little home button over there and you'll see that my laser moves into the home position. For me, that's the top left hand corner. That's where the limit switches for this particular laser are. And again, you would have done that or seen that when you do your laser setup. Now there's a couple of basic actions over here. So you can actually jog your machine. So you can jog it to the right or to the left or down and up. Just be careful when you do this. Make sure that either you've got limit switches installed or you're not going to push it past the mechanical limits and damage your machine. So you can actually set the iterations. Here you can see it's set to 10 millimeters. So every time I push the arrow, it actually moves 10 millimeters. You can set that to 20 if you like. It will move 20 millimeters. And so that's actually a very helpful way to jog your machine, put it in the right position. One of the reasons you do want to home it is you want to make sure that it's always in the 0, 0, 0 position when you get started. Now there are a couple of ways that you can actually position a piece using Lightburn, and that you use this laser window over here. And there's 3 ways you can do it, and it's really important to understand the differences between them so that you don't get really confused, damage your laser, and get frustrated because it's moving in the wrong direction all the time. The first one is current position. So wherever the laser head is at that point in time, that's where it will start. That's effectively the origin. So if you jog the laser, say by 50 millimeters down and 50 millimeters to the right, if I position my workpiece relative to that origin, that's where it's going to operate from. The second one is the user origin. So that one I don't use a whole lot. It's typically used for bigger machines where your homing point is far away from where you're going to put your workpiece. Then you might you could set an origin, so you could position the laser head where you want it to be as your origin, especially if you're going to be doing repetitive tasks, and you can set the origin. And then while the power is actually engaged for that workpiece, that will be your origin. You can then clear it as well and then reset it again if you like to. I don't use this a whole lot because my laser bed is fairly small, so if it returns back to the home position, it's not such a big deal for me. The final one is absolute coordinate. So that's always relative to your home position. So for me, that would always be relative to this position. Now I would use this typically if I was doing fairly repetitive tasks again, but I had to align a piece with a certain item. So if I was engraving a cutting board, I can put the outline of the cutting board onto my screen in the background, and then I could put whatever I'm going to engrave onto that cutting board relative to that. And then the machine, as long as I position that on my workpiece in accordance with the way that I've laid it out to my machine, then it's going to do that repetitively every time. All right, so for beginners, I would recommend that you just use current position. That's the simplest way to do it. You always know where your laser head is, and you can always position your component or the bit that you want to engrave and the bit that you want to engrave on relative to that. So that's what I'm going to do today. So I'm just going to home it so that I can get in the right position. All right, the first thing that you're going to want to do, and something that I really use heaps, is the trace tool. So I'm going to import an image. I'm going to go for a fairly simple one today. So this is a Captain America shield. Now, whenever you're going to engrave something, especially like an image or a drawing or something like that, your best file format for that is SVG, .svg file. SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphic. And the reason you want to do that is because you want to be able to make your graphic bigger or smaller without actually losing quality or resolution. So if I scan or zoom into this, you can see that this is actually made up of little blocks or pixels that are shaded different colors, and that's what gives me the image. So if I had to increase the size, all it does is it becomes pixelated. So the dots become a little bit bigger, and typically you would lose quality or resolution if you did that. And so one way of getting around that is that Lightburn and several other image formatting systems or software actually allows you to trace the image and convert it basically to an SVG. So what you do is you right click on the image and you say trace image, and you get a little pop-up window like this. What it effectively does is the software looks for contrast and then draws a line basically where it changes the color. Now this doesn't work for everything. Ideally you want to start off with a crisp, clean image with a high contrast in terms of what you want to engrave. Things that are grayscale or have like small bits of text in them, they don't really come out very well. And you will see also that it actually rounds the text. So basically it tries to fit a curve to these items. And if you want nice, crisp, clean text specifically, you're not really going to get it using this method. You're better off to type it with a different font using Lightburn itself. Right, I'm going to get rid of this anyway, so this doesn't really bother me. Normally you can play around with these settings, so typically you can increase the smoothness, increase the roundness, and increase the threshold that it starts to look for the contrast. I wouldn't play around with this too much. Typically I found that the default settings on Lightburn are actually more than adequate. You'll find that if you have a little bit of a more complex image, you might want to play around with these things a little bit and get you a better image at the end of the day. Something else at the bottom here, it says delete image after trace, so that is selected. If that is deselected, it will give you two images. So it'll give your traced image and your old image. If you want to do this iteratively, I would suggest that you deselect this item, because then you can basically delete whatever the result is of this trace and then try again consistently. But I know that this is going to be good. So if I check that box, basically it will delete my bitmap image and it will only leave the SVG effectively. And you will see that it's now a nice smooth curve, and it's excellent actually for engraving. It also means that if I scale it up and down, I don't lose any quality, and that's really an awesome feature. And you'll also notice that I don't really want to engrave this text, so I also can't just select it individually because it's all one group. So they've got this handy feature called ungroup. So basically I ungroup it, and it basically breaks these things apart, and I can individually select them as I want. So I can then select the text that I want to get rid of and then delete it. Now again, you would want to be careful with that, because again I can move different parts of this thing around, and I don't really want to do that. So I would select the whole thing again and say group. Now basically when I click anywhere on this image, it moves as a group and I can't actually deselect it. So that's great for me. Alright, so I'm just going to make a small little item for this. Another thing that you can do is actually position it. So this is X and Y position. This is relative to your origin. You can see my origin starts there, 0, 0. So this is my X axis and this is my Y axis. If I wanted to position it relative to something, or relative to a grid, or relative to a coaster, I can actually do that. In this case, again, I'm just using current position instead of absolute coordinates. Now you can actually see that the green dot is showing close to where I'm going to engrave, but the laser head is not actually physically in this position. And that's where it can get pretty confusing, because relative to your workpiece, it could look like it's actually going to engrave it here, but all this is showing you is that wherever your laser head is relative to this position, that's how it's going to engrave it. So it's really important to note that if this was in absolute coordinates, you can see it moves back to the origin where the laser head actually is, and then it would engrave it relative to my origin. But because I'm using the current position, it's saying wherever that laser head is, this is where it's going to engrave. Alright, so just be aware of that, because this can get really frustrating if you don't understand what's going on. The second thing you're going to want to do is just make sure that you've got your width and height right? If you're just doing a test, it doesn't really matter. And this is also relative to the position. So if you wanted to use this tool, these locations that you put it is relative to the top left corner. So that's effectively the origin of my piece. If I wanted to change these coordinates relative to a bottom corner, the center, the bottom middle, or whatever, I could just change it with these dots. I don't use that too much. I try to keep it consistent to top left, and that way I always know I'm positioning it relative to the top left position, and that's the same that I position it basically with the 0 axis on my work base. Right, so now that we've got that sorted out, effectively the next thing you want to do is, because I've imported this, you will see I've got layers. Now, if you know anything about engraving or lasers, you'll know that using layers is actually one of the best features that you have. Now, an example of using different layers is you would definitely have different settings to engrave something and different settings to cut something on the same material. So a layer, for instance, one layer could be to engrave something, and the next layer could be to cut it out. Now in this case, I'm only going to engrave, so I've only got one layer. But you can literally have multiple layers. You can see all of these colors at the bottom here are effectively different options for layers. So if I added something else into this, say for instance I added a square around this, say I was going to cut it out after the fact, I could make the square a different layer. And you can see it adds another layer, and then I can give it different properties. So I can make it engrave, I can make it cut, I can put a photo in there, I can do whatever I wanted really, and that just gives me a lot of options. Now for simplicity, we're just literally going to engrave the one layer. Now you've got several modes again, so you can say I want to engrave this as a line, which literally is a vector. So there's two big ways that you can, or two major ways that you can actually engrave something. So you could either trace the outline, which is this line engraving, that's typically known as a vector engrave. So vector literally just follows the lines around, and so it would go whatever the route of the engraving is. The other option is a fill. So fill would then fill in all the gaps between the lines, and that would create an image similar to what you would do if you were coloring in between the lines. And it typically goes left to right, so it would go x-axis left to right, and then it would fill it up basically by changing the y-axis. And over here, Lightburn actually gives you a very handy preview. So you can see the fill is basically what it does is it starts at the bottom and it just goes left to right all the way up, and it only engraves the portions that are between the lines. If, however, this was set to line engrave, you can see it will literally just trace the lines as a vector, basically. Now you can also see that this particular preview function is really a great function on Lightburn to give an expectation on timing. So this little number at the bottom here tells you the expected time based on your machine's requirements and settings. So it's basically calculates the travel time between, when it's moving between dead space, if it is moving between dead space. It also calculates the time that you're going to engrave it, and then it gives you an expected time. I found that this is generally pretty accurate. Obviously, the longer your engraving goes, if you're going multiple hours engraving sometimes, then that will be a lot higher. Now, again, one of the benefits of using a line or a vector engrave as opposed to a fill is that it's significantly quicker because it's literally just tracing the lines. You can see this one's just over 2 minutes, whereas if I made it the fill and did exactly the same preview for the same size, that would almost be an hour, 56 or 57 minutes. So it takes significantly longer. And so it's also important to understand what you're going to engrave and how you are going to engrave it, because that can make a significant change on what your image is going to look like afterwards, but also how long it's going to take. All right, so for this is just an example. So I'm going to do a line. An offset fill is something different. So that basically does a fill, but by using vectors. So it will literally draw all the lines in a vector type format. But that's a format for another video. That actually gives an awesome look, but it's outside of the scope of this particular instructional video. The second thing is speed and power. So these are, again, very important. So I know from trial and error that the optimal speed and power settings for this particular laser on this particular piece of material is 2,100 millimeters per minute and 55% power. Now, I wouldn't worry about this too much when you're just starting out. Typically, you could Google recommended settings for plywood or wood engraving or whatever you want to start out with, you really just want to make sure that you get your first engrave. You can tweak the settings a little bit later. I'm going to make a video on that, but somewhere probably between 55, 60 or 70% on your laser should be fine in terms of power. And then again, just Google recommended settings for your particular laser just to get you going. I wouldn't worry too much about this at all. What you do want to check is that your number of passes is set to 1. Otherwise, it will do the same thing multiple times, and you're not going to get a really good results out of that. The second thing is output. So again, this is for layers. If I did a layer where I was positioning this relative to something else, I could, for instance, draw a rectangle. If I was going to put this thing on a cutting board, I could draw a rectangle the size of the cutting board, which would then allow me to position this image relative to my cutting board. But obviously I don't want to engrave the cutting board, so I would switch the output off. You can see if I switch that output off, because I've only got one layer, there's actually nothing to engrave. But that's a very handy feature if you're positioning something relative to something else, that you can actually switch the outputs on and off. The other thing is show it, so you can either show it or hide it, for obvious reasons. If you've got your Air Assist connected, you can switch that on or off with your software. Mine is not connected in this particular machine. Alright, so basically what we've done now is we've imported our image, we've traced it, we've sized it, we've said that we're going to do a line engrave as opposed to a full engrave, and we've got the settings correct. Right, so the next thing we want to do is frame. Now this again is one of the most important pieces of or tools in any laser software. You need to be able to frame something, and the reason you want to frame it is because you want to make sure that where you think it's going to engrave, it is actually going to engrave. Alright, so if I click this button, it basically draws a rectangle over the location where it's going to do the engraving. Now, because I've set it again to current position and not absolute coordinates, it effectively goes right from where the laser head is. So the square frame literally takes the outermost boundary and draws a square around the edges. So you know that your engraving is actually going to move inside that. The circular one, it actually traces the outline. So because this is a round edge, this will actually trace the round edge. And all it really is a more accurate frame. So if you've got something where you really need to be pretty sure where this thing is going to go, then I would use this one. It does take a little bit longer, but at the end of the day, it does give you a little bit more accuracy. I most often just use the square frame because that's fairly simple. All right. Now, the other thing that we want to do is there's three things I always run through, a checklist that I run through before I start any engraving. The problem with lasers is that if you don't, if you've messed up a piece, it's very difficult to retract that. So if you've got a piece that you want to sell at a later stage and you've started engraving but it's not right, it's not in the right position or the right settings, it's very difficult to recover from that. So you really want to make sure that you're doing it correctly first time. And that checklist is the coordinate system. So is it positioned correctly so that it's going to engrave in the right place? The second thing is the height. Have I set the height correctly so that the focus is the dot that's the smallest? That was a previous video of mine. I've already done that on this particular machine, but that's the second checklist you want to do. It's very easy, especially if you're using different thicknesses of material, to get that wrong. You think you've set it up, but you haven't actually, and then when you start engraving, you realize that nothing's happening, or it's engraving too dark or too light, or whatever the case is. So check your height, and the final thing is check your settings. So make sure that your speed and power is correct. Whether you're cutting or engraving, make sure that it's adequate for your material. All right, so I've done all of those checks now, and I'm ready to go. And yeah, let's click start and see what happens. Awesome, and there we go. There's our first engraving. So that just brings to a conclusion the first engraving, and I hope this was helpful. Lightburn is really powerful. It's got a lot of amazing features, a lot of the CAD related features over here. I'll get to in a later video. You can put text in it. You can, do relative images. You can put photos in here. It's really an amazing tool, but you can make it as simple or as complicated as you need to. When you're first starting out, it's best to just get the basics right and make sure that you're doing this the right way. So I hope this was helpful to you. If it was, please like and subscribe. It really helps me to make more videos. And if you've got anything that you particularly would like me to make a video on in future, please drop it in the comments below. Thank you. Cheers.